Hello everybody, welcome to my book reviews, and today we are going to look at After Kathy Acker by Chris Kraus. This is actually a promo copy. This is what the book cover will look like. It's a lot easier to hold as well. After Kathy Acker by Chris Kraus. Now, Chris Kraus you might know as the author of I Love Dick. And for those of you who don't know who Kathy Acker was, she was very much the enfant terrible of 1980s literary scene in New York. She is a controversial, or was a controversial, poet, essayist and novelist who worked on the east and west coast of the States throughout the 70s and 80s. She was a very explicit writer, talked a lot about female sexuality and female representation in very challenging ways. In fact, some of you may have already seen my vlog Blood and Guts in High School, which was Kathy's definitive work and is going to be, to coincide with the publication of this book, it's going to be republished by Penguin Classics in a few weeks. Now, so why did Chris Kraus pick to do a biography of Kathy Acker? Well, in her writing, Chris had been very open about how she was beginning to feel an increasing identity solidarity with Kathy and how she could see her writing developing in the same way that Kathy's did, and therefore she was drawn to do some research on Kathy's life. And what she found is fascinating, because this is a mightily impressive biography. Chris has done exhaustive archival research. This book is packed full of not just of excerpts of Kathy's work, but she also draws from personal letters, ongoing conversations she had with friends and lovers of Kathy, and all of this is pulled together to paint and create and bring to life Kathy herself, but also Kathy's world. And what makes this really fascinating is Kathy is a particularly complex figure who certainly drew a lot from her own life and brought it into her work. She also had a tendency for myth making, and what I particularly like about this is, as Chris says, she was a friend of Kathy's. Kathy died prematurely at 50 because from cancer, which she decided not to treat, certainly not with any orthodox means. She refused chemo and preferred to try and treat it through astrology, which, you know, didn't really work. But Kathy's life was a very complex one, and certainly this isn't a sycophantic piece of work, that's what I'm trying to say. And I think Chris is pretty straight about cutting through the sort of self-serving white lies that Kathy used to build around herself, because myth making was important to Kathy. It was important for her to be seen as a writer almost as much as actually being a writer, and what that entailed. It entailed a bohemian life, open sexuality, open relationships. But not all of that was necessarily true, and there was a very interesting weave between raw honesty and these white lies that Kathy could create about herself. Myth making was important, and Chris really gets behind the scenes and under the skin to really bring to life Kathy's relationships right from her childhood to when she died. What is fascinating is how much you learn really about not just Kathy, but also particularly about female sexuality and self-expression and female representation. Because most of us won't actually know that much about Kathy Acker. Certainly her legend has largely faded recently, and not many people have read her works. It's probably fair to say that Blood and Guts in High School is her definitive watermark and is the high point of her literary output. And certainly there is a lot of excerpts in here, so you can really get familiar with Kathy's work, but it's also quite clear that Blood and Guts probably was never replicated in its brilliance by any of other Kathy's work. But what it really brings into account is how women are represented and how they choose to represent themselves, and also the politics of that, because Kathy's work was extremely explicit. Kathy herself had a series of open relationships. She worked in sex shows. She had very open BDSM relationships. And I think Kathy really weaves in the sort of how Kathy herself was particularly had difficulties with that, how that also represented a very complex self-esteem, as well as being very confident and open about what she needed sexually to be fulfilled. And I think what's interesting that is, of course, the 70s and 80s were meant to be an era of the post-free love era. Everyone was meant to be sort of era of feminism, era of equality, but of course there was a lot of judgment on Kathy, and certainly on her output as she wrote about these things, which is still evident today. If you see my vlog of Blood and Guts in High School, it is still a challenging book to read on female sexuality. So even if you don't know much about Kathy Acker, I would recommend this wholeheartedly. It is easily going to be the most definitive biography of Kathy Acker that I think is ever going to be published. There's a wonderful cover phrase about how it really investigates the constellation of Kathy's friends and lovers, and I think that's a brilliant phrase, because it really is a constellation. Kathy's universe was unique and remarkable and weaved into a lot of people, other famous people, as you can imagine, from 70s and 80s New York and East and West Coast creative and other writers. This is a wonderful book. It's page turning, it's not hard, it's not too inaccessible. It's fascinating and challenging, and I came away with a huge amount of sympathy for someone who was a very combative, complex character, and I think Chris Kraus has really done Kathy Acker justice in this amazing book, After Kathy Acker by Chris Kraus.